Hey, thanks for everybody coming. Welcome. I'm Mike Waits, Freese and Nichols. I run our stormwater practice. I'm the principal in charge on the iSWM project for Freese and Nichols. Ben McWhorter's also with Freese and Nichols. He's the project engineer on iSWM. We're going to be your instructors today. As Jeff mentioned, the topic that we're presenting is downstream assessments, and you can call it a paradigm shift, you can call it a change in the way we think, but we're here to really kind of try to educate you on that, what it is. We're here to talk about, this is really in competition with the detention policies that everybody has currently. You either have a thou shalt detain policy or you have a downstream assessment policy. And right now, I'd say most of the people in the Metroplex have a detention policy that's out there. And hopefully today, what you're going to get out of this is we're going to walk you through the difference, try to explain the concept of it to you, and walk you through the steps of it. Let me ask a question to start. Who in here thinks that we have simplified detention policies and drainage calculations so much today that it might not be as effective as we think when you step back? We've got one. All right, only one person. All right, well, my goal today is when I'm done, I'm hoping I've got more than one person, because I think we have simplified it so much today that it's not nearly as effective as we think it is. I think we're putting in ponds we don't need. I think we're putting in ponds that are actually causing problems. And I don't think we know that, because we have just tried to make it so simple for the developer, so simple for the developer's engineer who doesn't understand how to do it, that it's not working. So what we're going to run through today is I'll talk about the concept with you, try to give you some of the background, the theory behind what is downstream assessment. You're going to hear people say, oh, it's too expensive. So I'm going to talk about a little bit of the effort. We've done a couple dozen of these, and I can tell you to where you have some ammunition for that about how much does it cost to do this. Ben's going to walk you through 4 steps of how you do a downstream assessment. We're going to go over 3 different examples that we've done, just kind of show you what kind of data you get out of it, how that can lead to better decisions, and then we'll just draw some conclusions and have some Q&A at the end of it. So jumping straight into the concept, if y'all are listening today and you go back and you read section 3.3 of the criteria manual and section 2 of the technical manual, they were handouts over there on the table when you walked in. These are the 2 sections that talk about downstream assessments. I think if you read those and you're listening today, part of the discussion, asking some questions, I think you're going to have a very good feel for the concept. This isn't a real hard concept. How many people in here are engineers? So most everybody, there's a few that aren't. There's a few steps in here where, from an engineering perspective, we're not going to go through, we're not going to teach hydrology, we're not going to talk about how you calculate the curve numbers and stuff. We'll talk about how you need to change those, but I wasn't going to go through and explain the hydrology piece of it. But we are going to go through and explain how you do the actual assessment piece of it. So why would you even do a downstream assessment? What's the purpose? Well, the first one is, it's the very reason that cities hire engineers to review developers' submittals. It is you're trying to avoid a problem. You're trying to review something, make sure it's in alignment with other city goals, projects, objectives, and you're trying to avoid them doing something now that you have to spend millions of dollars later to fix. That's the first objective. The second one, unfortunately, we live in today's age where you better have all your I's dotted, all your T's crossed. You better have a very defensible project. Somebody is very likely to sue you somewhere throughout your career on one of your projects, and it's another reason you want to do a downstream assessment. You'd want to have it documented thoroughly what impacts that development caused. The third one on there is probably one of the best benefits of this is you likely, when you do these, you will find a situation to where you do not need to build a detention pond. That means when the developer comes to you and says, oh, these are expensive, I can't afford to do them, at some point that developer is going to have one that he does that saves him the land cost, because he doesn't have to put a pond there on that land, doesn't have to excavate the dirt out, doesn't have to build in the head walls, the riprap, the vegetation. The city doesn't have to go out and inspect it. The city doesn't have to maintain it. All of that cost can be saved because you've done some analysis up front and identified you don't even need to build it. And then the last one, I think this is the most important, is I do a lot of development reviews for cities, different cities across the Metroplex. I help do it. And the more data, the better. So it helps everybody make better decisions. It's a win-win for all. If somebody has done some homework up front, they've taken their blinders off, they've looked out beyond their property lines, they look downstream, they've noticed that the city's done some downstream improvements, or the city has downstream projects in progress, or that there's existing problems downstream, and they bring all that to the table along with their development. That just helps the discussion, gives you more ideas, you're going to make a better decision. So I've already kind of hinted around what the current and the new philosophies are. And again, paradigm shift, philosophy change, whatever you want to call it. But the old way of doing things is you put your blinders on and you have a policy that says, under existing conditions, there's so much flow that crosses your property line at a certain location, and the peak flow of it in a 100-year event is X. You shall, when you develop, you're going to put down more concrete, you're going to put down more rooftops, that's going to make more water run off, you're going to increase the peak flow, you're going to increase the volume, and the detention policy is going to say, put in a pond and throttle down that pond to where you don't let any more peak flow out than what's in there today. That's the current philosophy. Call it the iSWM philosophy, the downstream assessment philosophy. The idea behind this is just like when you throw a rock into a pond. It hits, it causes a fairly significant ripple, and it starts going out from there, and the ripple gets less and less and eventually plays out. Same thing with the development. When that development comes in along a creek, along a storm drain system, and it changes the concrete, adds more concrete, more impervious area, it changes the time of concentration, it has an impact downstream. And the closer you are to that development, the bigger the impact is. The farther you get away, the more it plays out, and eventually it dies off. That's called this zone of influence. That's the term you'll find in iSWM in the downstream assessment language. That zone of influence is how far downstream a development would have an impact. That's what you care about. So you'll see us talking today about, well, we want you to identify that zone of influence. Look downstream. What's in that zone of influence? Has the city done a study? Are there models available? Are there already drainage problems in that zone of influence? Are there already city projects in that zone of influence? That's really that first step. So we're looking beyond your property limits. Take off your blinders. Don't worry about peak flow off your site. Let's look downstream and let's start looking, are we changing the flow or the velocities downstream in this zone of influence? That's this new shift. So to try to explain a little bit better on the theory on this, you can see up on the screen that there's two tributaries, tributary 1, tributary 2. They come down and they meet at what we're calling a confluence. That's where those meet together, and that's where they combine. For those that aren't engineers in here, what you see on the left is hydrographs. What these hydrographs measure is along the bottom is you have time, and along the vertical axis you have flow, or we call it Q. So what happens is when it first starts to rain, the rainfall starts soaking into the ground, starts filling up the depression spaces, may even fill up some ponds along the way, but eventually that rainfall turns into runoff. So at time equals 0, you don't have any flow, so you're down here like this. As time continues, you start getting more and more runoff, and that runoff increases. So y'all have all seen rain events, you've seen it run off, and eventually you hit some massive peak, and it stops and starts going back down. So that triangular shape up there, that's called a hydrograph. That's really the runoff. The area under that curve, that's the volume of runoff. So if you look at this, and you've got tributary 1, tributary 2. Tributary 1 is the gray triangle. Tributary 2 is the striped crosshatch triangle. And that is the runoff hydrograph. That's the volume of water over time right at that confluence point. The dashed line up there is, if you take right where the rescinding limb hits the rising limb of the two, and you add those two together right there, that's where you get that new peak. So now on the single creek, after the two tributaries have combined, you have one hydrograph of that new creek. And it is the addition of those two hydrographs. So you can see the closer the peaks would be together, the more they would add together. The farther those would spread apart, the less they would add together. So that's the concept of timing. When those tributaries come down and combine together, that's how you would combine it. Now, let me ask a question, and don't look ahead like I just flipped ahead. If along tributary 1, the gray shaded one, if somebody were to do a development, which means that they're putting down concrete, they're putting down rooftops, they're going to send more volume, that's a hint, more volume of water down, but they're also going to put in a pond, and they are going to regulate that pond to where they don't let out more than existing peak discharge. What is going to happen to that gray shaded triangle? What is it going to look like?
Spread out, elongate, kind of trapezoid.
It's exactly right. It's going to go from this, you can't change this point up here, and you can't change, this point over here. It is, the time may change, it may shift one direction or the other, but it's going to elongate out. It's going to flatten. The rising and the falling limbs of that hydrograph are going to flatten out. It's going to look more like this.
Peak could be decreased depending on the volume you put in.
It could. The way they size their pond, they could decrease it. But in this particular example, we're assuming that they've kept the peak exactly where it's at. You can see how those limbs have stretched out. Now, you can also see that the peaks of these two tributaries now are closer together. And if you look at where those two intersect, the falling limb of the gray one and the rising limb of the crosshatched one, and you add those together, you can see where you've put a pond in, and because of how it changed the timing, and because how it generated more volume and shifted it over in time, we're actually going to cause an increase on the river downstream. This would be an example where if you had done a little bit of analysis up front, this isn't even, in my opinion, expensive to do, you could have avoided building this pond altogether. And here's just a little side-by-side where you can look at it a little bit closer if that helps you. But this is really the theory behind this whole downstream assessment. This is the conceptual thoughts. So really, the change in philosophy here is, it is all about this timing. It is about, we want you to do a little bit of effort up front. If you look at it from a data collection standpoint and identify that, hey, you know what, down in our zone of influence, the city's already built a new storm drain system. They built it for fully developed conditions. Stop there. I mean, put that down in writing, in a memo, send it to the city, go have a meeting with them and say, hey, we just did data collection in our zone of influence. Here's how far downstream we impact. And you've already built a fully developed system. We pulled the plans and they look great. We're good to go. We're done. How much did that cost? A little bit of research, a few hours of time, somebody digging up a set of plans. If that's not the case, then you move on to the hydrology, and then that's where you get into the timing of this. Let's do hydrology of the watershed without my development and with my development, and look downstream in that zone of influence, and then see, have I changed the flow downstream? Now you'll see I haven't mentioned velocity yet, but when you read the documents, velocity is mentioned throughout. But there's a formula called Q, which is flow, equals V times A. That's velocity times area. That's a pretty standard formula out there. If you don't change Q, and you haven't done any work to change the area, then you're not going to change the velocity. So the idea is you can do hydrology. You don't have to go do surveyed sections and do a hydraulic model to get to velocity. If you're not changing the flow, if you're not increasing the flow, then you're not increasing the velocity. So from an effort standpoint, I do City of Lancaster reviews, and since 2004, they've had a downstream assessment in their manual. So we've reviewed several of these. It is very typical, and I won't stand up here and lie to you. You're going to hear developers say, oh, this is costing them money, and you're going to hear engineers say, this isn't true, this isn't accurate, this, you're doing it wrong. We went through, and I actually pulled this for our internal, working with our transportation groups and our site development groups. I pulled together some numbers, and I tried to educate them, our transportation, our site development people, as well as just educate them on the cost of this and let them know, guys, this is really a value-added thing here. It doesn't cost that much up front, and we could make your project better and potentially could save you a lot more in construction dollars by having us do some of this analysis up front. So what we came back with was, when I looked at several, was we're sitting about 40 hours of an EIT. That's probably about $3,000. And you're looking at a few hours of a senior person to QC, check it. That's the average cost. We've had them vary anywhere from $2,000 to $10,000. The biggest variable in this cost amount is whether hydrology is available or not. If you don't have hydrology, then you're closer to the higher end. If you do have hydrology, then you're closer to the lower end. Like that, the $2,000 number, there was already a city watershed model. That's the biggest differentiator here. So if you've done watershed on the hydrology and you can give that to the developers, you're going to save them money. I mean, they're talking literally, I did one, the city of Lancaster called me and said, this developer will not be able to do this assessment. Can you just do it? And we spent 4 hours doing it. I mean, it was a very straightforward, the models were already there, we just had to break it up. Now the extra time came in, that was the low end, but the extra time came in having to then go meet, talk about it, write it up. But the actual model time itself was like half a day. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben to go over the steps on how to do one of these assessments.